let's see, who do we have on here? That if anybody has any questions about things, one of the things that Erin and I were just talking about is that for the very last class, we were thinking of trying something a little bit new, which I have done with graduate students in person, and it's worked really well. Whether it will work as well for you guys or not, I'm less certain, but to have the 3 MRDA awardees and maybe somewhere between 3 and 5 additional people that about 2 weeks before the next class, have people turn in specific AIMS pages, and then have these specific AIMS pages reviewed as a peer situation to make sure the specific AIMS pages really get the significance of the work and the clarity of it really, really down. Because one thing that should be true, that specific AIMS pages should be really understandable to pretty much anybody who has basic common education level, and in this case, people who are doing biomedical, clinical translational research, and that this works really well to allow people to understand how somebody else who's somewhat outside of the area will view it. And that's a really important thing, especially for folks who are applying for K awards or F awards, because those applications are seldom reviewed by really, really 100% subject matter experts. So you have to get your point across to people who might not be completely familiar with the area that you're studying. So we'll see how that works. I think it might work really well, but I've never done this through BlueJeans, so we'll see how that goes. But does anybody have any questions or comments before we get started on the last kind of lecture class? So with that, the last class is really focused on you've written your grant, you've submitted your grant is reviewed. And to try to understand what your reviews mean, how they're generated, because that is often something that's really, really confusing to somebody who is not familiar with the NIH system. So the first thing that you'll see probably when you log into the NIH system, so to back up a second, that once your grant is submitted, you will be able to look on the NIH ERA Commons site, and there will be information that will give you a date about when this grant is going to be reviewed. And grants are reviewed through a lot of different formats. It could be through a chartered study section where there's a specific date and time, and there's a lot of in-person meetings. There's also these, there is a webinar type situation, there's a blog situation, but that date will be probably the first date that that grant is being reviewed. Now, usually within 2 to 4 days later, your impact score, the actual numerical score of the grant, will be posted on the ERA Commons website. Now, usually within a week, maybe 10 days after the meeting, you'll get an email saying you can now log into the Commons website to check your score. Just usually, though, the scores are actually on the website anywhere between 3 and 5 days prior to that email going out, which, knowing that, sometimes leads to somewhat obsessive behavior, at least on my part, where I know when the study section met, and I know the scores are usually up within a couple days, and I'll start checking and refreshing my ERA Commons to see if those scores are up. But if you're patient, within a week or so, you'll get an email saying to check your scores. Now, what your scores look like, they're scaled from 10 to 90. And if you're getting a score of 10, your grant was basically considered perfect by the study section. There is no higher score than a 10. While a 90 is the worst possible, and a grant with a 90, basically, the reviewers felt it had no virtues whatsoever. Now, how that numerical score comes about is that when the reviewers review your grant, they're going to give your grant an overall impact score, and that's on a scale of 1 to 9. Now, there are 3 assigned reviewers that score the grant, and they'll each give it a score 1 to 9. And that there is also so prior to the actual study section meeting, those scores are averaged, and then they're rank ordered with all of the grants that are assigned to that study section. Now, that the grants that are in the top half of the grants that were assigned to that study section are discussed. Generally, the grants that are in the bottom half that's going to be reviewed by that study section are not discussed. You might have also heard the term triaged. And this is basically to sort of prevent people from piling onto a grant that has a lot of problems. And it also is to be respectful of the reviewer time, because pretty much it's impossible for a grant that's in the bottom half of the grants that were submitted to ever be funded. So they don't want to have reviewers have to spend a lot of time in a study section meeting discussing grants when most things a lot of being said is negative. So after the top half of grants is decided, those are the grants on the discuss list. Now, what happens is that the primary reviewer, the person who is assigned as the first review, gives a short, anywhere between 2 to 3 minute summary of what the grants is about, and then they maybe spend a minute or two talking about the strengths and weaknesses of the grant. The second assigned reviewer then either agrees or disagrees with the assessment of the primary reviewer, and then the third assigned reviewer does the same thing. Then the grant is opened up for discussion. Now, a standard study section usually has between 20 and 30 members on it. The 27 people who were not assigned to the grant often didn't read the whole thing. That very often they'll take a look at the biosketches of the applicant, and they will read the specific aims page or skim the specific aims page, and then maybe glance through the body of the grant. This is one reason that it's really, really important for the specific aims page to be so accessible to a wide variety of people, particularly if you're, let's say, applying for a K award, that the 3 assigned reviewers may or may not be subject matter experts. They're going to be knowledgeable in the area, but they might not be direct experts. It's very often that the other 27 members of the study section who are glancing through your specific aims page are not experts in that area at all. However, their scores are given the same weight as that of the assigned reviewer. So the 3 assigned reviewers basically give it an initial impact score. They make arguments saying why they gave that initial impact score. And then the other reviewers for the application, or the other study section members, ask questions to make sure that the reviewers have really, really good reasons for giving a particular score. Then everybody present at the study section gives it a score from 1 to 9. Now, when the final score happens, that all those scores are given, they are then averaged, and then the final impact score is multiplied by 10, is that average multiplied by 10. Now, in most cases, what that means in practice is that when you see your impact score, you're either going to see a not discussed or a plus underscore. That meant that the grant was not discussed, aka triaged. However, if you see a numerical score, that means your grant was in the top half. That you're probably going to see a range somewhere between 10 and 60. And this is because of the triage. Now, if you happen to see a 0 at the end, in other words, a 10, a 20, or a 30, it probably means that all of the reviewers were in complete agreement. Maybe that all 3 reviewers gave it a 2, and they gave convincing arguments so that the non-assigned study section members also gave it a 2. So the average was a 2, and it was multiplied by 10, and you got a 20. But it's not at all unusual that impact score might be a 23 or a 32 or something like that. And that occurs because the reviewers were not in complete agreement. Maybe that one reviewer gave the grant a 3 and the other 2 gave it a 2. And then when it was presented to the study section, some people scored it a 2, some scored it a 3. And that would have the average be 2.3 times 10 is your impact score of a 23. So the thing you have to understand about impact scores, though, is that as long as you received a numerical impact score and your grant was discussed, the impact score doesn't necessarily tell you a lot about whether your grant is going to be funded or not. And the reason is that grants are actually usually chosen on percentiles, and funding is chosen on percentiles. Now, the percentile is basically how your grant stacks up against the competition. And as an example, if you see let's say your score is a 13 and it received a first percentile, that means your grant is in the top 1% of grants submitted and reviewed by that study section on the last 3 study section meetings. So since most regular study sections see maybe 100 grants a time, that means that it was in the top 1% of the 300 or so grants that had been reviewed in the prior year. And the reason that's really important is that different study sections have very different cultures in relationship to impact scores. And I'll just give you an example of my own from relatively recently, that I got an impact score of 27 on a grant, and that was a 12th percentile, while a score of 23 was an 8th percentile. In contrast, for another study section, an 8th percentile could easily have been a 16 or a 17. And it just comes down to is how tough a grader your study section is. And since they don't want to disadvantage grants between study sections, because an institute may get grants from anywhere between 3 and 20 different study sections, the percentile is much more informative to them than the actual priority score. Okay, so any questions about impact scores versus percentiles? Okay. All right. Now, if sometimes you will see no percentile coupled by no impact score, and that means that your grant was in the bottom half of the applications the study section saw. And this means you have essentially no chance of being funded. And that if you decide to reapply, you really should think about drastically rewriting your application. And it could be that it just needs a drastic rewrite for settling significance, or it might need a drastic rewrite in approach. However, sometimes there's things that there's no percentile, but there is an impact score. And that means that your grant was reviewed where there's no percentile history. I'll use as an example the Center for Translational Research grant that that the MRDA program is funded under. That grant went through competing renewal at NIH this spring, and it received an impact score and no percentile. And that's largely because there's so few CTR grants that are ever reviewed, percentiles aren't meaningful. So the program officer is just basically working on impact score, and there's really only one study section that reviews these anyway. So it also could be that your grant was reviewed in a special study section. And special study sections can happen if, let's say you are collaborating with a big name. Your grant can't be seen by a regular study section. and there wasn't a good place to bundle your grant with. Under that circumstance, it might have been reviewed by a very special panel. Again, there's no percentile history. And the only way to really know whether those impact scores are going to be funded is contacting the program officer. In other words, the NIH official who is going to make the funding recommendations later. Now, you might have a impact score, but with a high percentile, over 45. Sometimes you'll even see percentiles that are over 50. And what this means is that you were at that not discussed threshold. Maybe you were the last 2, 3, 4 grants that the study section saw. Or it could be that there was a big disagreement among the reviewers, so that maybe you were on the initial not discussed list, but that one of the reviewers thought your grant had a lot of merit, so that they said that this grant should be discussed, and it was pulled off the not discussed list to the discussed list. And in that case, it might be that that person was unable to really change the minds of the other reviewers. So it was discussed, but it got a poor priority score. Now, it's always great to see a percentile in the top 10%, but percentiles in the top 10% don't guarantee funding. That there have been cases in history where percentiles even in the 6th percentile weren't funded. And that was like back at the NIH sequester. But it also has issues with institutional priorities and how many grants in a particular area were reviewed. There was a case at the National Eye Institute a few years ago where all the top people in the field of infectious corneal disease seemed to all submit grants at the same study section. And all of the top percentiles at that study section were in grants in a particular research area. And NIH just can't fund all of those top grants because they aren't just looking at percentiles. They have to fund a range of science, and they can't spend all of their funding just submitting or just funding one particular area to the detriment of all of the other areas that NIH funds. So there are cases where there were some folks who had great grants that just weren't funded because there were a lot of other great grants in that particular research area. However, percentiles more than 10%, while they're less great, absolutely you could be funded. And a lot of people who are listening to this are early stage investigators who have not received independent NIH funding before. And there is a big advantage for early stage investigators. And you might have a grant that has 18 or 22 percentile, and because you're an early stage investigator working in an area that there's not enough grants coming in, your grant may be funded. So these are all things that you have to keep in mind when you're considering what your score might mean. Okay, another thing you have to understand is that the terms percentile, success rate, and pay line are not the same thing. That success rate is what NIH publicly advertises. And that if you look at the success rates for most institutes, they're anywhere in the 15 to 25 percentile range. But the problem with success rate is that if you submit a grant and you get a grant number, and then you later resubmit it, and the resubmission is funded, that counts as one success. So this means success rates are always higher than the percentile that most funded grants receive. It also, success rates can count things like one-year bridge awards, that there are grants that are submitted that the program officer really, really wants to see funded, or they're competing renewals for mid-career investigators that didn't really get a high enough score to get a full 3, 4, 5-year award. But there's some money left over by the Institute at the end of the year they may fund that grant as a one-year bridge award to give the applicant the opportunity to reapply. So all of these mean the success rate is a lot higher than the percentile or the pay line. Now, the pay line is the percentage where the institute tries to fund all grants who do better than this. There are some institutes that publish pay lines. They basically say if all that they will fund all grants that have a percentile, let's say, better than 9%, and all new investigator grants that have a percentile better than, let's say, 15%. However, there's a lot of institutes that they have in-house pay lines that they work from, but they don't make them public. And this is because that if they don't make their pay lines public, they then have more flexibility in deciding funding, particularly in the example that I gave where all the top grants coming into the study section were in the exact same research area. The institute wants the flexibility to not fund all of those. And one thing that's really important to understand is that there are grants that that have worse percentiles. In other words, higher percentiles that might be funded while other grants are not funded, even though they scored better. And this is because of institutional priorities. Maybe the institute really wants to see grants in a particular area. There just hasn't been a lot, and they'll fund them. Too many grants in an area scoring well, young investigator status, and so forth and so on. So under these circumstances, how do you decide if you need to reapply? Or, what your chances really are, which is often pretty important because let's say you submit a grant for the June deadline. That grant isn't going to be reviewed until September or October. And the actual grant will not receive funding until the end of March in that circumstance sometimes. So in that situation, you really need to know, what your status is. Because you need to plan. Are you going to have to reapply? Is there, do I need to think about ramping up my research and so forth? And really the only way you can know this is by contacting the program officer at the NIH. However, you see the score within 2 days to a week after the grant was reviewed, and you want to know right then whether your grant's going to get funded. And unfortunately, contacting a program officer at that point isn't going to be useful, and you shouldn't contact them yet. You should wait until you actually receive the written reviews. And that usually takes anywhere between 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes a little bit longer, after the grant is reviewed. And this is because NIH can't give unofficial, and because the program officer needs to see the reviews to get an idea of what the reviewer said about the grant. They need to really have a feel for, what went on. And one thing you have to understand is that program officers will not give you an answer by email. And this is because they are unwilling, because if they send an email, then they're making an NIH commitment in writing. And they really can't do that. Most program officers are happy to talk to you over the phone about where they see your chances, but they're not going to tell you in writing. So what you want to do, though, is use email to make an appointment for a phone call. Do not cold call an NIH program officer. The reason you want to make an email to make an appointment for a phone call is that they can then review your situation and know what they're going to say to you. When they cold call, they might not have looked at your reviews yet. They might not know what the score is. They might not have had a chance to think about your research area. And particularly cold calling anxiously and being pushy is a really bad idea because the program officer, can only tell you what they know. And that often they won't know for months out after it was scored whether or not there's a chance of getting funded. So after you've used email, you've made the appointment, and you're on that phone call, the program officer will basically give you the read of their situation. They'll say that the chances of it being funded are very, very poor. If they say that to you, you want to ask specific questions about whether you should reapply, what it might be important to change. So under that circumstance, you will have read the reviews. You will be able to ask specific questions about how you should interpret those reviews and the program officer's advice. Now, one thing that's really, really important when you talk to the program officer, getting grant scores can be career ending, or it can be career building, depending on what they say. But the program officer is not the one who scored your application. They can't make more money to fund more grants, and they certainly can't fund poorly scoring grants. That in ideal situations, your program officer can become your advocate. If they think your research is really, really great, but your grant didn't score well, they can really help you out a lot in how to kind of reevaluate where you should be going. And they can also be your advocate. And if your grant is in the middle, that program officer can be the one to really advocate for what your grant being funded for end of year money or all sorts of things. So definitely you always want to be polite to the program officers. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. All right. So the next thing is that you have to know how to read your reviews. The thing that's probably the most frustrating to interpreting and reading NIH grant reviews is that the grant reviews are not written to you as the applicant, and they are not intended to help you improve your application. That they are intended to help the program officer decide which grants to recommend to fund. And one thing you have to understand is that if your grant reviewers actually did put constructive advice, that might have been edited out by the scientific review officer. And NIH reviewers are actively discouraged from giving anything that could be perceived as mentoring. Now, this is very, very frustrating as the applicant, because it means that you might not understand specifically what you can be doing to improve the application. However, this format is very helpful to the reviewer, or to the program officer, because the reviews are focused on what was really important about the application. Why would the application make an impact on the field or not? And this is how, in the end, the funding decisions are being made. Is your science going to really change the paradigm of things that are going on? Is it really going to make an impact on the field or not? That very often, if there's a lot of details, the point isn't the details. The point is overall the impact of the work on the field. Now, another thing to sort of just be aware of is that getting a grant score is going to feel that, especially one that's not great, is going to be the same. You're going to have that same reaction that you do when you get the reviews back from a paper. You're going to be mad. I mean, I don't know anybody who doesn't see paper reviews or grant reviews and their first reaction is just being mad. And part of that is just the anger phase of grief. You put a lot of effort into that grant and you got a bad score and you're really, really mad about it. And you're not in a position to really read and understand what the critiques were. So what I usually recommend is that you look at the score, you skim through the grant reviews, you read stuff, you're angry, you're frustrated, and then just put them down. And that you need to really put them down for a couple days or a couple weeks until you can settle down. And then you want to analyze those reviews. You want to analyze them on a line-by-line basis. and write. It can even help to take all the reviews, put them into a Word document, and after every single written sentence, you make notes to yourself. Is this a positive comment? Is it a negative comment? Is it a neutral comment? And if it's a negative comment, really try to think about where that negative comment is coming from. And this is a place where you can get experienced grant reviewers in your institution or field to really help you with that. Just be really careful to not discuss this with anybody who's a member of the study section. So at the end of the reviews, there'll be a list of everybody who participated in the review of your grant. And you cannot talk to anybody who's on that list, but you can definitely talk to your mentors and other experienced grant reviewers. It sort of allows you to read stuff between the lines, but to really dissect what the reviewer said, and that you read a comment, you get mad, you then back up, you say, well, I said that in my grant. Well, then you should go back and really read the grant and see where you said it. Maybe it was in a place that it wasn't easy to see. Maybe it wasn't written clearly. And once you have done that analysis and you really are kind of unclear what some of the score drivers are, then you can discuss those reviews with your program officer. And some program officers are willing to spend a lot of time to help you understand your reviews. And these are particularly program officers who like to mentor investigators. However, some reviewers aren't willing to do that. And if that's the case in your situation, you just have to accept that. Okay. Now, as you're looking at your review, you have to understand where the important parts. So you have the overall impact scores with an overall impact statement. And then there will be criterion scores. And the criterion scores are on investigator, environment, significance, innovation, and research plan. Now, while only the overall impact score is what's considered, you have to realize that it is not an average of the criteria scores. And some of the criteria might not even be that considered by a particular reviewer. The NIH has done analyses, and they find that the impact score and the research plan score often have the closest correlation. But that's because these are research grants, and the research plan is a really, really important piece of it. Now, when you see the format, is that you will see the written comments. They're generally bullet points. They're usually not paragraphs. The written comments are supposed to explain the score given to a criteria and the impact score. However, they may or may not really tell you what the biggest issue is with the grant, but might just justify the score. Now, so you understand what these definitions are, investigator, that's you. That is basically based on what your training and productivity is, and whether or not that is a strength, that means that you're likely to be able to get the work done or not. Environment, that is your research environment. At one of the earlier lectures, I talked about how the environment description is really, really important. That is driving that criteria score. And your job is to convince the reviewer that your research environment is sufficient to be able to get the work done. Because it doesn't matter if it's a great research plan. If the environment doesn't let you get it done, it's not going to get a good score. Significance, is this an important problem that is really addressing an unanswered question in the field? Innovation, is this a creative idea? Is this a creative hypothesis? Are you using cutting edge techniques? And then research plan, that is the science. So the thing about impact is that impact is the overall odds that this work will forward the field. So it means that it has to be doable. In other words, the investigator and the environment have to be great. It has to be important. It has to be well done, and that's your research plan. Okay. Now, again, like I said, though, the written comments may or may not tell you what the biggest issue with the grant is, but may simply justify the score. And this is really can be frustrating for the applicant because when you read the written comments, maybe there aren't anything that seems really substantive. Maybe those reviewers only seem to pick on little things that they don't really talk about main flaws. And usually that's happening because they are not into you. And there's an article that I sent Aaron on this, that it's essentially that the reviewer thought the science was fine, that, yeah, we need to know that, but the approach is fine, but the project is blah. It's a topic that the reviewer doesn't care about. That it's just not exciting. It's just like, yeah, you can keep doing that, but it's really not going to change anything. It might be good to know, but it's boring, is essentially. And reviewers, basically, there's no place in the review template for the reviewer to just say, it's boring, it's not interesting. They might say that under the significance, but it's basically your project is blah. And it could be it's blah for a few different reasons. Is that if you're getting this vibe that it's blah, that's where you really have to concentrate on reframing the scientific question that on the concrete comments. And you have to be brutally honest with yourself. Maybe the question is trivial. Yeah, it's good science, but who cares, really? And if it's really that you have proposed an application to study something trivial, you have to reevaluate what your science is and really try to find a problem that is going to be considered important. But it also could just be that the grant was submitted to the wrong study section, to the wrong mechanism. NIH has shown that your grant scores are higher when reviewer expertise is very high, because those are the people who've made their life's work studying the problem, so they're innately already more excited about it. Another thing to keep in mind, though, is that it could be the way you framed your argument. That it could be that it's really exciting or important, but it's just you made it as deadly dull as possible. And that's why you really have to point out the significance of the problem. Now, let's say that it's pretty clear that you're not going to get funded. Maybe your grant was triaged. Maybe it just didn't get a fundable score. And the question really comes down to, should you resubmit? NIH gives you the ability to resubmit an application once, where the reviews basically follow the application and you have the opportunity to rebut and change your application. Now, this as an overall fact of the matter is that you're never going to get money if you stop submitting grants. For most fields, if you stop submitting grants, you don't have a research career because it's expensive what we do. And it's also really important to avoid what I call the Wile E. Coyote syndrome. If you've ever watched the cartoon Wile E. Coyote, he gets some pretty great ideas on how to catch the Roadrunner, but they fail once, often for random reasons, and he completely gives up on that good idea and tries something completely new instead of refining an existing good idea. And that's something that you should really, really consider is that maybe it's a really great, exciting idea. You just it's not there yet. You don't have enough preliminary data. You need to refine the arguments. However, there are also situations where you really should just rework your ideas drastically and send in a completely new application instead of resubmitting. As a rule of thumb, if your grant was scored and the critiques seem addressable, there are things that, yeah, you can change the application, you can get that additional preliminary data, you can address that your expertise, you should absolutely resubmit, because the chances of a resubmitted grant getting a funded score are actually pretty high. However, if your grant was not discussed, that's where you really should think about it. It could be that your grant was not discussed. You really should just rework it drastically, reset the clock, and start over. Some of it is that because you don't want bad grant reviews to follow your grant when you have so drastically changed it. Also, however, there are cases where a not discussed grant can get funded. I have personally taken a grant that was triaged on the first submission and then gotten it funded on the second submission. But the thing you have to understand is that grants that were not discussed on the first submission, there's a statistically rather low chance of getting funded on the resubmission, because it's a signal that you really need to rework your ideas and submit that as a new application. All right. So let's say you've gotten to the point where you want to resubmit your application, that you get you will be revising your application, and then you also get a one-page resubmission for resubmission. And that's basically where you can rebut the reviewer comments or proverbially say why you complied with the reviewer comments and have improved the application. That this page is somewhat like when you resubmit a paper for publication and you're rebutting the reviewer comments. However, when you're resubmitting a paper for publication, you usually want to rebut every single reviewer comment in detail and explain how you changed things in detail. But I personally have done rebuttals to papers that were 12, 13, 14 pages long. For when you're resubmitting a grant, you get one page for the rebuttal. Now, some things that are really, really important here. One is tone. You do not give snarky responses to the reviewer comments. Even if you feel like you want to be sarcastic, do not go there. Because even if that reviewer does not see your application again, already reading a snarky rebuttal makes even a new reviewer not very charitable to you. If the reviewer missed information and said it wasn't there, the most likely thing is that you didn't write a clear application. So you should apologize for not making it clear and then say that you have rewritten that, made it more clear, and this is where that information can be found. Now, what you often want to do is address every prior comment as explicitly as possible. However, you don't have room to do it like a paper rebuttal. So what you want to do is look at all three reviews. You want to look at the common themes, and usually there are common themes, and you want to address those common themes in the first paragraph of the revised application. That then, if there's some specific pointed comments, you can then talk about those. Again, keep in mind that you might not be able to rebut every single detail here. But also on the other side, the reviewer comments probably won't be as detailed or specific as they are for a paper review, simply because NIH reviewers are directed not to give that kind of very, very specific feedback. Now, one thing that's very important to not get yourself in the trap of is that you read the comments and you feel they're unfair and you feel that the reviewers are stupid. The chances of the reviewers being stupid are very, very small, because all reviewers used for NIH grants are PhD or MDs who have successfully received prior funding. They're likely to even be currently funded, and that they are usually very familiar, if not with your topic, with the general area of science. But this is where grantsmanship's really, really important, is that if you don't make your arguments very, very clearly, that your reviewer is unlikely to be able to follow them in the hour or so they're going to spend reading your application. Remember, you've come up with your ideas over the course of months or years. The reviewer has to understand them in less than an hour. So that's where really, really writing things and saying things explicitly are really important. Okay. As I said, rapport, don't ever write a rebuttal while angry. And that the worst thing you can do is to be angry and lash back out at the reviewers. And this means that your tone of your rebuttal must be respectful. Also, when you're preparing your revised application, get new, recently dated copies of your letters of collaboration. Or let's say somebody's sending you a reagent, or they're going to give you access to a patient population. The reason you want to get new letters is because, one, things change. People get rid of their mouse colony. People change institutions so they no longer have access to a patient population. Also, that if this collaboration or this reagent is crucial, you want to be in regular contact with the person. And that between the time you submit and resubmit, it's 9 months or more. So you want to have a recent date so the reviewers know that everything is good, nothing's changed, and that stuff is still going to happen. Okay. So the take-home message is that you really have to respect the process of grant review. One thing that I would look into is that NIH does have what they call an early reviewers program. And you can go onto the NIH website and you can apply to be an early career reviewer. Early career reviewers are usually people who have faculty level positions who do not have their funding yet, but they're asked to come maybe review 2 or 3 applications and sit through a full-blown study section. After sitting in the study section, you really get an entire different view of the process. It becomes a lot less us versus them, and a lot more that your job is to explain what you're doing very, very clearly to expert reviewers. Now, there are times when a review is unfair, a review is biased, a review was a mistake. NIH does have a process for appealing reviews. It's usually never a good idea to use it, because the vast majority of the time, you're not going to be able to prove that there was a bias in a review. You're not going to be able to prove that the reviewer was stupid, because they weren't. And that all appealing does is make everybody involved in the process feel uncharitable towards you. And a lot of it too is that people get angry, they appeal, when they actually wrote a crappy grant and they need to go and learn from that rejection about how to write a better grant. If you are fortunate to get chosen for the NIH Early Reviewer Program, one thing that you will very quickly realize is that reviewer bias is much, much rarer than applicants assume. That most people will not give their best buddies a great grant score, because your professional colleagues aren't really good enough friends to basically compromise your professional ethics for. And so really take the process to heart. Okay. So with that, the things that you really need to think about here are that that you have your reviews. You first get your score. That score will allow you to imply where you need to be. 2 to 3 weeks later, you get the written reviews. That you basically have to do the best you can to reverse engineer what those reviews say, even though they are not written to you and they are not intended to mentor you. Take advantage of your colleagues to help you read between the lines. Definitely take advantage of the ability to talk to your program officer, but do not cold call them and do not expect them to give you a straight answer by email. Once you have an idea that you're going to resubmit your grant, that please write your rebuttal letter ahead of time. That there was a recent situation of a colleague of mine who wanted advice on how to write the rebuttal letter or the rebuttal document for their grant when they were 3 days prior to submission. That you want to be working on those rebuttal letters weeks or even a month or two out, so that you know exactly how you're going to craft that document. You don't want to do it at the last minute. And and sometimes that you're not obligated to resubmit. If you feel that your application needs extensive reworking, you can then submit it as a new application. It will get a new grant number, and the prior reviews, which might be negative, will not follow you. So instead of you can go ahead and take those reviews into account, and you can just submit a new application. That can be beneficial sometimes if you don't want a poor set of reviews to follow your grant to the next submission. So with that, I don't think I have anything else to say, but I'd be really happy to take comments and questions from people. Any questions, anybody?
This is Nira. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. What's up, Nira?
Oh, hey, I just wanted to say thank you. And I think that was super helpful for you to clarify that about the reviewer comments, that they're not intended to provide constructive feedback to the grant writer. Like that was definitely news to me, and I think definitely helps clarify sort of how we go about interpreting and responding to their
it's very different than papers, because papers are really meant to help the when you're doing paper reviews, they're written to really help the person improve their paper so that it can get into the scientific literature. But and this was something that changed maybe about 10 years ago when I started grant reviewing, that it wasn't at all unusual for reviewers to be mentoring applicants for better applications. But when NIH went to the reinventing peer review, they changed the scoring system and they went to impact. That it all came to be about, is the work going to make an impact on the field or not? And that mentoring the applicant isn't really the point. The point is telling the people at NIH, this is the impactful science that needs to get funded. So, any other questions? Any other questions or comments, folks? Okay. One thing is that I'm also always happy to, like if you end up in a situation where you got your reviews back and you're having trouble interpreting them, I'd be happy to look at it. A lot of people who are on these calls are doing work that's a lot more clinical than I do, but I'd still be happy to look at them. And that one thing that can be also helpful is that when you're looking at the reviews to get different people's opinions, because very often different people will read those reviews a different way. So any other questions? For those of you who are MRDA recipients, we are planning the last one of these to basically be almost a peer review of your specific aims, with a particular look to, are your specific aims really accessible and understandable? Because one of the things that I mentioned is that your final impact score isn't just based on the 3 people who really read your grant in depth. it's also based on the other 20-some people who might just scan through the specific aims page. Also, the program officer might only be reading your specific aims page. And then when the final funding decisions are being made, they're made by a group called the NIH Council, which those folks are very senior scientists who are asked to basically almost provide a secondary round of review about which grants get funded or for how long. And those folks also typically only read the specific aims page. So having your specific aims page being understandable and outlining science that's exciting to as broad a group of people as possible is really important. And by having people from different areas take a look at your aims page, that can really help whether or not you're getting the impact across to a broad range of people. And Erin is going to be organizing that, and and I know that there's going to be a few people invited to do this that are not 3MRDA recipients. So if you're interested in participating in that, contact Erin, and she can set you up. Okay. So any other questions? Okay. So I think we're done for today, and it's been a pleasure, folks. And again, if you ever have any questions, you're always welcome to email me.